If the West were to impose an oil embargo on Russia, that could be devastating. It could bring Putin to his knees. So Trump does have the ability to do something like this if he chose to.
Given what you said a moment ago, Bill, about Vladimir Putin never having really compromised on anything significant in his political career, why do you think the White House still appears to negotiate in good faith with him?
Well, we don't know whether they're negotiating in good faith. We don't even know what has happened in all these back rooms. We don't know what the plan B is. We don't know what the real agenda is. All we can do is watch this from afar and say what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense here. American people, the American population, the general public doesn't like Vladimir Putin. Republican senators and Republican members of the House of Representatives don't like Vladimir Putin. And so it doesn't make sense that Trump would be acting against American interests and the interests of his own political party. But we don't have all the information. We don't know what else has been agreed. We don't know what else has been promised. All we can do is sit here and scratch our heads and say, this doesn't quite make sense, but we don't know why.
On the economic point, I mean, were Trump to become angry with Putin if Putin rejects this ceasefire proposal, and let's say he were to go further when it comes to sanctions on Russia, how badly would that hurt the Russian economy now? A lot has been made of the value of the ruble and the threat of stagflation. Is that a pressing short-term problem for Putin, or are we talking about the longer term that'll store up difficulties for him?
Well, sanctions are a very broad term. You could sanction 10 individuals, and that wouldn't have any impact on the overall situation in the country. Or you could sanction all the oil that's coming out of the country, which is where Putin makes all of his money, and that's where he gets his money to continue to fight the war. If the West were to impose an oil embargo on Russia, that could be devastating. It could bring Putin to his knees. So Trump does have the ability to do something like this if he chose to. There's a lot of reasons why America and other countries haven't gone after the oil so far. And the reason for that is that Russia produces 10% of the world's oil. If you were to take 10% of the world's oil out of the supply and you have the same demand, then the price of oil goes up. And we're living in a world where governments and countries are desperately trying to avoid inflation because there's so many people suffering from inflation. And so it's a very hard thing to decide to do. And I think that so far, we haven't seen any appetite to live with inflation in order to starve Russia of their financial resources.
Is there anything that could be done to go after Vladimir Putin's personal wealth? According to lots of people, he is the richest man in the world. Is there a way that Western governments could target that?
Vladimir Putin is the richest man in the world. However, he doesn't keep any money in his own name. The people who hold his money are trustees, nominees, all sorts of proxies of different sorts. And we have sanctioned those people. Those people tend to be the oligarchs. And if you see an oligarch who's worth $20 billion, chances are that 10 of it is the oligarchs and 10 of it belongs to Vladimir Putin. So he is suffering. And when we see these oligarchs, money frozen in the West and so on and so forth, that's also Vladimir Putin's money. And he hates that. It's very, very upsetting for him.
But I suppose the worrying thing is Donald Trump probably knows that, but sort of respects, in a weird way, Vladimir Putin for accumulating such wealth.
Well, one of the things that's most worrying for me coming out of the Riyadh meetings was the intimation from Secretary of State Marco Rubio that there was a possibility of lifting sanctions. And so if we were to do that, that could potentially be a huge benefit to Putin.
One of the Ukrainian demands, likely demands in any future peace talks, is for reparations from Russia. Now, it seems very unlikely that the Kremlin would ever agree to that. But do you think the West may at that moment choose to go, okay, what we'll do instead is use the frozen Russian assets, give them to Ukraine, and help Kyiv rebuild in that way?
Unfortunately, we're in a situation where all that talk about rebuilding Ukraine is extremely premature. We're in a crisis moment right now where there's a potential that the U.S. is going to throw Ukraine under the bus, stop military aid, which makes up 40% of all the military aid that Ukraine receives. And therefore, any of those frozen assets, and there's quite a few of them, there's about 300 billion of it, needs to be used to defend Ukraine. I think we can talk about reconstruction when Russia has stopped invading Ukraine. But at the moment, it's all about survival of Ukraine and defending Ukraine. And that's what the money needs to be used for.
So, Bill, if it were you on the phone to Vladimir Putin today, what message would you want the United States to convey?
That if he doesn't agree to an unconditional ceasefire that lasts 30 days, as the Ukrainians have, that he will triple military aid. He will give the Ukrainians full license to use long-term missiles to attack Russian military targets inside of Russia, and that he will do everything in his power to cut off the money that's received from the sale of oil.
And even Vladimir Putin, in those circumstances, the man who does not compromise, would have to concede, surely, if that were the threat.
I can't see how he would not, but I don't think that will be the threat, unfortunately.
You think there's no chance, even with Trump's unpredictability, that he may swing that way if he thinks Putin is being deliberately obstructive?
There's nothing in his body language, there's nothing in his statements that would indicate he would do anything even remotely connected to that type of scenario.
And do you think even if he did agree to a ceasefire, Vladimir Putin would respect the ceasefire?
Absolutely not. I think that Vladimir Putin, there's been many ceasefires. That was the reason, that was the statement that Vladimir Zelensky made in the Oval Office. He told President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance that Putin doesn't honor any ceasefires. And on the back of that, and he went through the whole history of Minsk I, Minsk II, which were both agreements where Russia was supposed to cease fire, where they didn't. And that was the thing that provoked Trump to jump down his throat and humiliate Zelensky in front of the entire world. Putin doesn't honor ceasefires. Putin is a liar. He's not a good faith negotiator. And so I'm sure that if he, under what circumstances he agreed to some 30-day ceasefire, he would then stop the ceasefire, blame it on the Ukrainians, and carry on. And by the way, one of his conditions is that there's no military aid to Ukraine during this ceasefire. Well, what does that do for him? It gives him a military advantage at the point when he wants to break the ceasefire.
I wanted to ask you, Bill, about what the Europeans are doing at the moment. You've got the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer ramping up his talk about assembling a coalition of the willing to potentially be peacekeeping troops in Ukraine. You've also got Germany today, for example, the German parliament voting to approve changes to their debt rules, allowing them to spend more on defence. How significant is that currently, or is that a bit of a sideshow to the main event of these talks between Trump and Putin?
I would argue that what's going on in Europe is not a sideshow at all. It's equal or even greater than what's going on between Trump and Putin. The European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, and other countries supply 60% of the military aid to Ukraine. If Germany is approved $1 trillion increase in defense spending, they're going to become a very powerful player in this whole thing. I think it's very unproductive for the Europeans to sort of slink back into the corner and say that they have no position in this negotiation or they have no agency in this negotiation, when in fact the Europeans and the UK are major players in this whole story.
And do you think Vladimir Putin ever sits back at night and reflects on the fact that what he was aiming to achieve from his full-scale invasion has, from a strategic point of view, massively failed? I mean, you've now got two more members of NATO in Finland and Sweden. You've got Germany changing its historic debt rules in order to increase defence spending. You've got the UK, France, and many other NATO countries, including Poland, ramping up defence spending as well. I mean, that's the opposite of what Vladimir Putin would have been hoping to achieve. Do you think he ever reflects on that?
I'm sure he doesn't. I'm sure all he's doing is just thinking to himself, what do I do today? What do I do tomorrow so I can stay in power and stay alive? He's not thinking about, was he right or was he wrong? He's only thinking about what does he need to do to stay alive? And that's the only thing that keeps him up at night is just how does he keep all these plates twirling in the air so that none of them crash and break?
Just finally, Bill, on the Trump-Putin relationship, is there a danger for Vladimir Putin that he's pursuing this tactic, this tried and tested tactic of stalling, of waiting to see what the most viable option is, of not committing either way, of creative ambiguity almost? But that may have worked in the past with other presidents, but with Donald Trump, who has a very short attention span, who wants to feed the news cycle constantly, the Trump administration has been moving at breakneck speed, that maybe Vladimir Putin can't cope with the Trump timetable, that he may frustrate Trump through his reluctance to commit one way or another. Is that a real danger for him?
Well, I think Vladimir Putin is such a sophisticated operator. He's a KGB spy. He's been doing this for like 50 years. He knows how to deal with any different type of person. He's studied them top to bottom. He'll figure out how to manipulate Donald Trump. He's manipulated all the presidents. All of them wanted to make nice with Vladimir Putin. Started with George W. Bush, who looked into his eyes and saw his soul. Then things went really badly wrong in that relationship. And then Barack Obama shows up and he wants to do a Russian reset. And they even showed up with a reset button. Uh, then you had Trump, the first Trump, who comes in and says he respects Putin and what a great guy. Then you had Joe Biden come in and says he just wants to make life predictable for Putin. And now you've got Trump too coming in and talking about how they both were suffering under the Russian hoax. And so, Putin plays all these guys as best as he can, and he plays them well, and he gets whatever he wants. And he's been around for 25 years. All these other people come and go.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.